Hi, and welcome back to part 2. This video is aimed mainly at teachers, and it looks at using VCOP and building writing skills as a whole school approach. So, the first thing to understand is that this really does go as far back as the pre-primary. So we need to understand how writing, the developmental stages of writing in young children. So starting with our tots and our triple noughts, we have the scribble drawings that we see, and to children, if we talk about their experiences and writing in this way, that represents writing to them. This then becomes more purposeful mark making that children do, and that is their writing. Then children start to see that writing happens from left to right and that it has more of a structure to it, and we'll see mock handwriting or like scribbles like this instead of the round scribbles of drawing, where children are aware that they are writing to communicate meaning. Then children start to see letters as individual shapes, and they start using shapes to represent the letters and the writing. So what does this mean in the pre-primary? It means that on a Monday or whenever in the week, we ask children to tell us what they did and to write their news. This is an actual photograph from outside one of our classrooms. This is Jerome's weekend news, and he says, "I was playing soccer and I scored." Now, in this picture, if we look very carefully, we can actually see some very distinct mark making that Jerome has started to use to represent him writing his news. In a previous video on Reading Rock Stars, one of the videos is entitled Approaches to Teaching Reading, and it discusses the language experience approach. The language experience approach is what feeds into this in developing writers. And here we are using children's own experiences and asking them to write about it because we want them to understand that reading, text, words, and writing has meaning. And how more powerful can we be than attaching the meaning of these images and these letters to actual experiences of the children. Then in stage 5, you'll see that children start to write words, which are strings of letters. They don't actually make words, but they're starting to realize that letters go together and make a word. And you'll start to see that as they're writing new words, they start to leave gaps between the strings. This is transitional writing, where you'll start to see the gaps, right? Where the spelling and the letters and that aren't actually accurate, but they're starting to realize that words then make up a sentence. Here, children are now inventing their own spelling. So now they realize that there's specific letters that make specific words and sounds. So this comes naturally. We cannot teach this, but what we can do is expose children to experiences and create opportunities for them to develop these skills. And that is how we teach writing. But we can't say to children, leave gaps or this is a sound, but you can ask them to draw on their learning experiences. Then children begin to actually decode and encode sounds and make up their own spelling. Here's an actual example from one of our grade R's in a previous year. Here you can see the child is at the stage where they haven't started to make separate words, but they are stringing letters together. And if you look at this very carefully, so what happens, the child draws the picture, they write their news, they then read it to the teacher, who then models the correct spelling and writing for the child underneath. But look here, this says, "I went to play with my cat." But there's the I. And now the child is listening. Went to play with, and I don't know what happened to the cat. But can you see how the child hasn't started making separate words, so it's still a letter string, but they're starting to use their phonic knowledge. Here you can see it's a little bit more refined. This child says, "I painted with my mom." And here you can see I, and this is a sight word. It's a high frequency word, so children pick it up. Painted with. So I painted with. My, once again, this is one of those common high frequency words that is done as a sight word. And then mom, they can spell that for themselves. And it's a common word that they see, Mother's Day cards and all of that. Then we get to the more standard spelling where children start to actually write words in, using phonic families and different sounds. But here we have an example of a grade R child in the latter parts of the year, one of our students. And by this time of the year, the child is copying off the board. So the teacher wrote on the weekend, and then the children had to write their own news. Here you can see the child has begun to understand that there need to be gaps between the words, and they're starting to hear more of the sounds. So the child has written I, and then swam. So the sw sound is quite a complex sound for the child to discriminate auditory, with their auditory discrimination. So they are saying swam, Sam, and that's why they've spelt it like that. Once again, they then read it to the teacher, and the teacher models the correct spelling. Not telling the child that they were wrong, but then explaining to the child, oh yes, swam. Here you can see it up close. And this is a grade R child, and they are using their full stop. So here we've got we're not using ambitious vocabulary yet. We're not using connectives in that, but we're starting with some punctuation. This is an example of a grade R activity where the child has traced over the writing. I would hazard to say that our children can copy that off the board. Yesterday, today, and tomorrow. Here they'll drawing the pictures of what they would do. So they would do it like this in grade R. Later on in grade R, they could actually write it out with their own spelling. And in grade 1, they can absolutely do this with their own spelling. And what we're doing here is an informal lesson on tenses, as well as children understanding that stories can have different parts to them. This is another example of earlier on in the preschool where the children are working on sight words and high frequency words. And this also has its place for children to be able to look and copy. Once again, setting an example, modeling how sentences are constructed. And then you can have a conversation about the exclamation mark. This is an example of a grade 1's work. And you can see from this, though, that this child has done some sort of dictionary work. So these are not independently spelled words. And what we would do at our school is obviously encourage them to be using their phonics knowledge from THRAS to be able to decode and, what is that sound meant to be. But there is also a place for the children to have their own individual dictionaries where they'll come and say, how do I spell spinner? The teacher says, spell it out on your fingers and write it in the book, and then the teacher helps the child to get the correct spelling. Then the good old sequencing cards. So these are really great to be used in grade R for language development, for sequencing, and all of those pre-reading skills, also covered in a previous video, but it can also be used for the development of creative writing. So here is an example of what it would look like in the child's book. They stick in the first picture, and depending on the level that they're writing in, they would write a volume of writing. So grade 1 would write 1 sentence, whereas by grade 2 and 3, they can be writing far meatier sentences. And this is where you're talking to them about your VC, your O, and your P, getting them to write those small pieces well, right from grade 1 to grade 3. This can be differentiated for all levels and for all grades. If you're using your VCOP, the differentiation just happens organically. What's lovely about activities like this as well is you're starting to show children that stories have a structure, right? So we're not going straight up the story mountain, but we're starting on a little bit of a hill. And there's a beginning, there's a middle, there's an end. And as the children begin writing more, this organically becomes an understanding of paragraph writing. Right, so that is how we transition that for the children. Then, once our children are now comfortable with VCOP, they're comfortable with developing sentences, they're writing their sentences in a strong way, we start using open-ended story prompts to get them writing imaginatively. And this is really what's going to challenge them to use different sentence openers, to use different vocabulary and more ambitious language. And an example of something like this is there are tons of activities like this available. You can print them, laminate them, and for every, lesson that you're going to do this in, put out the whole range, let children pick which story they want to write. There's also other open-ended things where there's not even a question for them to answer. An example like this, they would need to write about, what is happening, what led us to this point, and this is going to now allow them to start having discussions in terms of planning our stories and doing spider diagrams to plan it, and drafts and rough drafts, because by the time they're writing at this stage, they are very comfortable with those skills that they need to be able to write a meaty piece of work. And that's how we get up the mountain. Once our children are confident in writing simple, short pieces and just getting their writing and their thinking on paper in a good and solid way, getting them to write well, we can then go to the next level. They've got all the skills. Now we can start talking about the story mountain. And obviously this all fitting into literacy and fitting into Writer's Workshop and even into our literature lessons in the senior primary. And that brings me to the end of how we're going to use VCOP in Writer's Workshop and how we're going to develop it throughout our school. I'd also like to encourage you to use the VCOP in your literacy and your language lessons, where children are writing sentences using their phonics words, where children are writing sentences using adjectives and nouns and things like that, always reiterating the VCOP. That even though that display doesn't change and it's there for the year, it is not a classroom decoration. It is something that your children are referring to all the time. And that is hopefully how our children are going to be able to take these amazing ideas and put them onto paper in an amazing way. Thanks for joining me. Please shout out to me if you have any questions or anything you're not sure about or any ideas to add. Love to hear from you. Bye.